All right, the last part of the protected areas unit that we're going to talk about are challenges to park management. A big one is poaching. So people illegally harvesting things that isn't allowed by the protected area rules. In most places, the biggest driver is poverty, where the incentive for poaching is getting money, but it goes against conservation in many ways. Sometimes, if rangers are underpaid, they may exploit the resources that they're supposed to protect. And so, paying rangers well so that they value the resources that they're protecting is definitely worthwhile. Thinking about how to solve this problem is really important. And some of it has to do with the consumer side, where we want to make sure that it's harder and harder for people to get their hands on endangered species and things that are poached. And CITES plays a big role in that. You'll remember the Convention for the International Trade in Endangered Species. The big role for that is to prevent the exploits of poaching to making it across international borders. But having the community be invested in protected areas and see a benefit from protected areas is a big way to limit poaching and help local communities as well as preserve biodiversity. A similar challenge is trophy hunting, and this is pretty controversial. Some people think that trophy hunting can be used to fund conservation, whereas other people are concerned about trophy hunting depleting populations and potentially supporting illegal markets. So after I'm done with this video, I'll put a video in that talks about some of the relationships that trophy hunting has with conservation and how sometimes how trophy hunting, the money from it can be used to fund conservation. So this shows some pictures. This is the big controversy with Cecil the lion, who was a trophy hunted lion that was very controversial and was actually shot in a protected area. This shows a confiscation of elephant ivory that is being burned. And this is also a controversial practice. Some people think that burning it makes the supply more limited, which can drive up prices and make it more attractive to poach or to trophy hunt large elephants. So I want you to think about whether you think trophy hunting and conservation can go together, or whether you think that that is not a good idea. An important other part of this is how do we mitigate illegal markets and problems with wildlife products that are legal in one place but not another. So what if there is a species that's endangered in one country but not endangered in another country? If its products are harvested in the country where the species is doing fine, it might be legal. So it can be hard to trace back the source and make sure, even if the consumer wants to make sure they're getting a legal, sustainably harvested product, it may be difficult to trace back exactly where their product came from. Sometimes suppliers deliberately mix legal and illegal markets together so that it's more difficult to trace where it came from to keep the profit up from the illegal markets. Another big challenge with protected areas is human-wildlife conflict. Some examples are wildlife harming people, wildlife harming livestock, and crop raiding. And we see crop raiding from a variety of different types of species, from birds to deer. Even elephants can be responsible for crop raiding. So thinking about some of the solutions to this, some common ones are compensation for lost crops and livestock, conservation organizations helping to put up fences and deterrents to reduce the conflict so that economic activity can continue, but also conservation can continue. Trash, I mentioned a lot of animals get into trash looking for food. Locking that up and being really careful with that has been very helpful. So we often see bear-proof trash containers in national parks and things like that. Another big challenge to parks is climate change, and this is going to be a big one that we haven't really solved. We've been dealing with poaching and the ideas of trophy hunting and human-wildlife conflict for a very long time now, but climate change is a newer problem that we have to think about. And so I want you to take a second, you can pause the video. What problems do you think protected areas might face with climate change? What can we do about it? So the big problems are that some species are going to need to move. So we want to make sure our protected areas are effectively conserving biodiversity. So should we put protected areas where biodiversity is now? If we do that, then that biodiversity may need to move outside of our protected areas. We need to make sure we're conserving genetic biodiversity so that species can adapt with changing environment. And we may have to think about some other things. There may not be places for some of these species to go. If there are species that live on the tops of mountains, maybe there's not a place they can move on their own. So what can we do about this? Some ideas are to establish reserves to facilitate movement, preserve environmental gradients, and perhaps focus on geophysical features rather than species. The idea being if we have protected areas where there are important climate mitigating features like rocky outcrops or places with lots of changes in elevation, so we protect continuous sides of a mountain so that species can move upslope if needed. And this connectivity will also facilitate movement as well. A big problem that we are going to continue to face is funding and personnel. Protected areas are often understaffed. It can affect the ability to maintain populations. For example, in Panama, greater frequency of anti-poaching patrols results in greater abundances of large mammals and the seed dispersal services that they provide. So having money to make sure those anti-poaching patrols continue to do their good work is important for conservation. Funding can also be provided by international conservation organizations to poor areas, but a lot of times it's still not enough. So this is an area that needs to be worked on. In general, and we've talked about this before, funding for conservation is very limited, and making sure it gets to places where it'll be the most effective is going to be very, very important. So that's the end of protected areas. We will move on next to thinking about conserving species and ecosystem outside of these protected areas.